Hey guys, happy Sunday. Welcome back to the podcast. I did create a new logo and actually change the name slightly. So I'm excited to roll this out. Pastor Christian did share the podcast with the congregation, which was just such an honor and a privilege to be able to be trusted by a pastor who is so passionate for caring for the sheep as he is, to trust me to share this information with you. So the new name for the podcast is If I Were the Devil and the War on Love podcast. So welcome to day 5. We're going to start off by, if I were an enemy of God, all right, what would you do if you were an enemy of God? If I were the devil, an enemy of God, and I wanted to keep people from stepping into freedom where they will make a huge impact on the kingdom, I would aim to disrupt this as early as possible. God had plans for Adam and Eve to have a baby where it would be fully loved, seen, heard, safe, and secure. But I was able to disrupt this process from the start. Instead, pain of childbirth, striving, insecurity, and a lack of learning how to love God's way from the start was my best move. With the stress of a life outside the garden, harmony was lost and parenthood would become a struggle versus a blessing for many. Stressed parents make stressed babies, so that instead of learning that love is patient, love is kind, God's way, they would be learning a different kind of love, a love that is not God's superior way. The less healthy and healed a human parent can be, the more destruction I can do. The best is when they blame God for this too. It is so unfortunate when those wounded people find God and learn His perfect love and heal their wounded attachments in a safe church and in safe relationships. So I work hard to make sure that Christians do not get healthy, that they stay wounded, because hurt people will hurt people and they'll have babies and keep this cycle going through generational curses. So welcome to day 5 of this devotion. I want to start off by just acknowledging a cool revelation that I had after I had communicated that I would need to stop doing the daily podcast because it was just getting overwhelming. So I am going to say I did skip a couple days, and I'm going to circle back to just the revelation that I had about that, which was super cool. And God is just so good and so faithful. And I love what Josh said today at church. God can do more with my obedience than I can use with my resources. And that is so true. So I want to be the best human that I can be by becoming healthy and being able to trust Him and not living in fear so that I can be obedient. So let's talk about what our needs are. And we're going to need to first define what those needs are from the perspective of attachment science. So I'm calling today the wounded self. And I know I had ended last time with a statement that God has a plan for how He wants to use how you were created for His plan and purpose. And when we live in fear, or we reject ourselves and become what we think others want instead of how He made us, or we are living in fear of being seen because of the shame, then we're delaying the process of how God wants to use us for the body of Christ in the kingdom. And that's not freedom. And it's also not walking in obedience and using the resources that God has imparted us with. And we can't use those resources in the best way possible if we're not being obedient. So I'm going to give just a super quick overview of attachment science. We're actually going to probably take a deeper dive into this at different points because it is absolutely so critical. And it's it's not complicated, but then there again, this is also what I do and talk about this day in and day out. So maybe the first time I heard it, maybe it did seem complicated. So we learn through repetition, right? So attachment science teaches us that babies' systems are learning how to do relationships very early. How a primary caregiver is able to attune and respond to a baby through nonverbal ways, such as eye contact and touch and soft eyes and expression of joy. Kurt Thompson has a quote that is really beautiful, that every baby is born into the world looking for someone who is looking for them. But what happens if the caregiver is not able to offer what that baby needs? the self is wounded by superior way of love is not given. And that child learns early that being oneself is not good enough and they have to figure out another way. So that's what happens when a baby is born into a family system where the parents, the primary caregivers, are not healthy in the way that the baby needs. So we're born as humans to have 4 core needs. And I teach this day in and day out because it is really important, because God tells us to guard our hearts, for from it flows the wellspring of life. And so we really do need to gauge who I'm letting in, who I'm keeping out, working on allowing the Holy Spirit to lead me and guide me. And what disrupts our ability to have boundaries, which is essentially guarding our heart, is we're not modeled that. We don't know that we have the freedom to do that, or that we don't have the confidence that if I have a boundary for myself, that that is what is needed. We operate from a place of fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, and from the ways that our love gets wounded, which I'm going to share a little personal story and experience to really make this point, I guess, hit home. So, which, by the way, when you're listening to the podcast, if you're ever listening to it in the car, I will sometimes be talking about things that you just might want to be considerate of the little ears around you if you're listening to it on a speaker, because I'm offering this podcast to adults, not children. And so I'm not thinking about censoring from that perspective. So as a parent, that is your job to do. So sometimes I'm going to drop words that you might not want to have your kids hear. And so just keep that in mind. I don't think I've ever given that little caveat before. So we have these core needs as humans, and our nervous system is going to activate when our needs are not being met, or they feel threatened. And so these 4 core needs that we have, that we're born into the world with, is that I have value, safety, acceptance, and connection. Value says I matter. Safety is I'm protected. Acceptance means I belong. And connection means I'm not alone. And so these needs are met through interactions, moments by moment, day by day interactions, from in the womb, infancy, and as the first year, and then the first 3 years, and 6 up to age 6. Those are the most formative years. And this is really the information that comes out from attachment science, attachment theory, and it is just so relevant to our humanity. So again, when these needs are not met, then I'm questioning, do I matter? And I don't feel protected. I feel unsafe. And I'm wondering, if I do belong, I'm probably feeling like I don't, and then feeling alone. So again, like I said, the last podcast, I had confessed that I was conflicted because I was overwhelmed with just the daily episodes. And I was caught between wanting to honor my commitment to do it, which is a value that I have, is honoring my commitments. And I do also really love doing this podcast for you guys. So I'm super excited to do it. It's not hard for me to offer this. It's just hard to balance all the other responsibilities. But I was trying to gauge that and balance that with my commitment to love God, self, and others, right? This is the greatest commandment. God tells us in 1 Corinthians 13, like, you can do all these things. You could do all these amazing things. But if you're not operating from a place of love, then you're like a noisy gong. And so I kind of felt that conviction and that little, like, oh my gosh, I'm doing this, great thing because I want to do it. I was asked to do it. I think it's really great. I think it's so needed. And yet, if I'm not operating out of love and stewarding that well, and my time well, and boundaries well, then I'm like a noisy gong, and I don't want to be a noisy gong. And so when I had that revelation, and I had mentioned it to my husband, we want to confess to one another. And sometimes in that confession to one another, we might get the answer that we need. And while my husband didn't really offer me other than just, you don't have to do it every day. I wasn't sure how do I communicate that when I had already said, hey, I'm going to do this daily. So I felt like the clarity that I got was that I need to do the right thing. I need to reorient. I need to confess this. And what I did was, and this is what the Lord revealed to me, was that I was actually breaking an old pattern that I had from a little girl. And I had a message from childhood that it's not okay to change your mind. And while that could be taken out of context, what I'm saying is there are some times where we say yes with certain information or even an incorrect place of commitment. And then maybe we feel a conviction. Maybe we got new information that makes this thing that I committed to not possible. But some of us with poor boundaries from our wounded attachments and kind of conditional love situations, we feel like we can't change our mind. And so it sounds so silly for people who have good boundaries or for someone who cannot relate to that. But I know there's a whole lot of people like me who never really considered that you can change your mind. And especially we want to if it's a conviction from the Lord, like I had about this podcast. So what I realized is I really kind of broke this curse that I had on my life before, that I operated from that place as a teenager, which continued into my adulthood, that I said yes to a lot of, I'll just say boys. I said yes to a lot of situations that I found myself in, things throughout my life for a lack of self respect, self value, self esteem, or self confidence. And that's because as a kid, I didn't get what I needed to know all those things. And I learned that loving others means something very different than God's way. So, God's way of the superior way of loving is love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others. It is not self seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrong. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. That is the superior way. That's 1 Corinthians 4 through 6. And, or I'm sorry, 4 through 7. So, what I learned in my family of how love is, is different. And I'm going to go into what love was like for me. Again, you might want to make sure that little ears are not around. Also, I feel like I need to say I am not here to dishonor or disrespect anyone in my family. That is absolutely not where my heart is coming from. I'm here, however, to tell my experience as I remember it and as I experienced it. And that's not dishonoring, it's telling a story about my life. And I'm doing this not to shame or dishonor. My intention is to help set the captives free, which I believe I'm called to do, and to bring glory to God through the ways He has helped me to heal, grow, and learn, and to bring hope to the hopeless. Of if you recognize things in my story and just that connects with you and think, wow, Danielle seems like she has a lot of freedom in her life and fruit in her life. And I do. And that's only because I've walked through healing all these wounded places. I still have yet to do part 2 of my testimony, and I will do that. And you'll hear more of just my struggles in my adulthood. I've already shared a lot about my childhood in part 1 of my testimony. But for me, here's how I grew up in my experience with what love was. As a little girl, what I learned through my lived experience was love is optional, not a commandment. Loving God is for some, but not for our family, unless that means a King James on the shelf and an occasional, you are not honoring your mother, when I was being rude to my mom. I learned that love is temporary. My parents divorced before I even had memory of my father and mother being married. My father did not choose to have a relationship with me. My mom had many, many boyfriends, live-in boyfriends, even husbands that came and went. They were temporary. And I also learned that love doesn't protect. I was in some situations where I was exposed to molestation from older boys, from not being cared for, not being protected, and there not being a consideration of what a little girl needs from in situations where there's unsafe people around. Also, and I also understand that I was raised in that point, early 80s, and it was a different world then. And I totally understand that there wasn't as much supervision needed in those days. So I do keep that in context. However, my mother's third husband was extremely abusive, extremely hurtful and harmful in every way you can imagine. And I was not protected from the abuse that man brought into our life. And I know there are circumstances that make leaving difficult and maybe even seem impossible, but the word says there's nothing impossible with the Lord. And when there is a marriage that is harmful and hurting vulnerable people and hurting, and there's no change because that person doesn't see a problem with it, or they're not getting help, they're not willing, and there's not that change, God does not put a covenant of marriage above the covenant of the standard of love, which is love is protecting. And so that is something that really gets lost in the church, and something I'm really passionate about. That yes, taking an oath, taking a covenant of marriage under the Lord, that is it's a serious thing. It's a serious commitment. And yet also, it is doing incredible damage to the hearts of many people, adults and children, when there's unhealthy people with a lot of brokenness, addictions, abuse, anger problems, etc. And those people are not willing to get help. And so a little girl like me was not protected, and a lot of damage was done. So I learned that love doesn't protect. I also learned that love needs to be attained through sexual experiences. There was a lot of adult conversations around me that was not censored for little ears. I heard a lot of things. I saw a lot of promiscuity all around me, and in my family and the people around at the parties that were happening. And so I truly believed that that's just what you do if you want to have a relationship. I learned that love is about being responsible for others' comforts and emotional needs, second to your own. Now, again, yes, I know that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves, but we are not responsible for another person's emotional needs unless we are a parent to a young child who is dependent on that. Adults are not responsible for other adults' emotional needs and comfort. We can support them, we can love them, we can model it, we can pray for them, we can encourage counseling, but I am not responsible for another person's emotional needs other than the people under my roof. And then there's even some limits to that. I was made to feel that I was responsible for dropping my needs when my mom was hurting, and I was not seen as having my own needs. There wasn't space for that. So that's where codependency is formed. And I also learned that love is only met if you have a really big need. I have memories, two things stand out. One is I faked an eye exam so bad when I was in second or third grade because I wanted glasses. And that might sound kind of funny and silly, but for me, what it was is I noticed from watching and experiencing how love was given that if I was sick, I got cared for. I got nurtured. It was just a different tone. I was seen. I was heard. I got to sleep in bed with my mom. There was just a different atmosphere when I was sick. And so my little child self remembered that. I also remember laying in bed and feeling a bump on my face, and I look in the mirror and I go and there's what I thought was a pimple, and I run out to the barnyard and I tell my mom, I got my first pimple, right? Who's excited about their first pimple? I was, because I thought that having something wrong with me would give me some good attention. Turns out I had chickenpox. And then I had a horse accident, a pretty significant one, running a horse, and the horse tripped and fell and rolled over top of me. And so that happened kind of not to that degree, but I got hurt on the farm somewhat regularly. And my point is that I could see how somebody could have hypochondria. And that is a condition where you just feel like everything is wrong with you, because I could see that, because even I had signs of that as being a little kid, and I don't know why, but I outgrew that. But I could see how someone could get stuck in that, or if someone learned that through maybe the only time they got comfort was over a piece of cake. I could understand how someone could get stuck in misinterpreting that love is actually sugar. Love is food. And then somebody develops a food addiction. So I know I'm kind of going off track here, but this is really important because how love was modeled for us, how we experience love, our system, our central nervous system, our hearts, our minds, all of it is going to be chasing after whatever feels like love to us. And if it was not, love is patient, love is kind, then we have wounds, we have grief, we have trauma. And that, if it is not resolved, then we will continue in some ways on an unconscious level, playing this out time and time again. And yes, we can make the unconscious conscious through talking, and Holy Spirit can reveal things. And sometimes it might be through a book, through a sermon. Maybe it's through my story. But these patterns will keep going and going and going for generations if they're not broken. And we can actually see this in epigenetics research. I think I mentioned that before. Not going to go down that train right now, but however you felt like you received love when you were young is probably how you're going after that in your older childhood and then perhaps into adulthood, which I'm going to share a little bit about how that showed up for me. So I also learned that love is only met if you do something extraordinary. I remember catching a trout with my bare hands while we were at this fish hatchery. It was one of my favorite memories, one of my favorite places. But I think it's because, I mean, it was just a beautiful place in general, but it was like I caught this trout and all of a sudden I was like the star. And I was almost always just felt like I was just there. I was just unseen, kind of unattended to. And so when I did that, it was like, wow. And the family still talked about it. So kind of ironic that I would then later be called attention seeking by my family. And I started to feel that way. Oh my gosh, I'm being attention seeking. And then it hit me not too long ago, actually, that I had this wave of compassion coming over me. I'm like, well, of course I was attention seeking because I had to do something extraordinary to get attention. And so what else would a child do, right? Now we want to eventually unpartner with some of these things that we started doing when you're young, and that's what recovery is all about. And I'm going to share more about that. But some other things, I was kind of a fast runner, never did track in school, but they tell me that I was called Danny. Danny, go race that boy, and I'd beat him. And I was pretty talented at riding horses. And so I did. I got into barrel racing, and that just became like something else that I was good at. And so but it felt like love and attention was only given if I did something extraordinary. I'm going to share a little bit more with less detail, but love hurts and harms. I already mentioned my ex-stepfather. Love neglects. I already mentioned I didn't feel seen. Love is great Christmas mornings. I have some of my favorite like nostalgic memories are around Christmas mornings and some of the traditions. And even now I feel myself getting a little choked up. Like it could be 364 days a year that I might have pockets of having a good morning, but man, Christmas morning, it was like just something about it of that unity and just again feeling special. I still remember my Christmas stocking for some reason that it was strawberry shortcake that my mom made from hand. And so love was great Christmas mornings. And so that nostalgia I still carry in my heart today. Love makes excuses for others' behavior. My mom always made excuses for my ex-stepfather and just other people instead of holding them accountable. Love is hypocritical. Do as I say, not as I do. Love is better drunk or high. That is just the environment that I grew up with. Everybody was drinking and partying and getting high and, having a good time. And that's just what I thought that adults did, to be honest. I grew up believing that love is selfish and it's only given when it's convenient. And I have really had to work hard to die to my flesh, kill my flesh that wants to only fall back into this pattern that was so deeply ingrained in me that think about yourself, think about yourself. And for me, a lot of that's driven from scarcity mindset, which is another pattern of the world that got infiltrated into me. There's never enough time. There's never enough. The Lord has just really been blowing my mind from, I think 2021, my word for the year was abundance. And I have really just continued to grow. Even I'm in a rapid growth season right now of even just him pulling me out of some of these patterns that did need to die. I did need to these things to go because they're so counter kingdom. And I also learned that love is without boundaries. I already mentioned that. And love must be earned for what you do, not who you are. So if Corinthians was written by the devil himself, this is what it would look like, because this created an immense amount of harm and dysfunction in my life. So my four core needs of safety, connection, value, and acceptance was not met most of the time from others in my life. And I did not have God until I was 19. So I had no healthy attachments. And that led to a feeling inside of me that something was wrong, that I'm not good enough. I have to do things to feel loved, to feel enough, to feel worthy. And I have to give others what they want if I want them to be with me. And I observed that in the adults around me very consistently. And so that's a lack of boundaries. Our brains are wired to seek pleasure, avoid pain, and operate on habits. And it's our brain's job of being able to put things on autopilot to conserve energy. So we that's how habits or addictions are formed, from this operating system that is coexisting, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, and operating on these habits. So I sought pleasure through drugs and alcohol and escapism, shopping, and trying to get boys to choose me. I avoided pain in those same ways, and also just convincing myself that I didn't have needs, so then I wouldn't get hurt, because if I didn't have any needs, then I wouldn't get disappointed. Nobody could let me down if I didn't have any reliance on anyone other than me. So thankfully, my drug use led to an addiction, which led to desperation. And my desperation led me to humility, which is I can't, I need help. And then the humility made it possible for me to ask God for help. So I was saved. I was loved by God. I knew that. I felt that immediately when I got saved. But I was skeptical about being loved by others around me. I always felt suspicious of nice people. What do they really want? And unfortunately, a lot of the time I was right. I have encountered some really creepy people who are just predators, and it makes me angry. I felt myself tense up. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm really just appalled at the way that there is predators in this world. I was a young girl, and I had a lot of older men approach me, seemingly being nice, and all there was motive there. And so that's just the evil world that we live in. And I do feel like that was like a magnet. And I'm kind of waking up to, in a big way, of I've heard this verse, I don't even know how many times, read the verse, like, no weapon formed against me shall prosper. And not too long ago, I had this like jolt of like, oh my gosh, that means that there's weapons formed against me. What is that? And so part of what I'm covering in this podcast is just how those weapons formed against us operate in both the physical and the spiritual world. So I didn't know how to be around people who love Jesus. I wanted it, but I didn't feel like I was good enough. I had dated someone who very young, and as I call myself a baby Christian, like probably 6 months saved. And this guy came in with his brother to where I was waitressing and asked me out on a date. And I said, no, 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 because I was only after, and I'm going to get into this was my trauma playing out, but I would pursue people and that I saw as a challenge, because that would tell me that I was loved and I had value. And so I didn't have a very good picker, because the way that my trauma was playing out, I would need to go after someone who was emotionally unavailable and not healthy, with some really strange desire to get them to see me, to love me, and change for me. Again, codependency. So when this really nice guy approached me and asked me out on a date, that challenge wasn't there. And he was unlike anybody that I had ever dated. And I wondered, like, what does he see in me? But actually, I was on fire for Jesus. And that's what he saw in me. He had never met anyone like me at that time. That was just so like, I just wanted to tell everybody about Jesus when I got saved. And so I would tell my customers about Jesus. And so I finally relented and went on a date with him. We did not have too many dates because I self-sabotaged. And that is because I had all this woundedness and all this skewed way of thinking about what love was, and just these wounded attachments. But not before he introduced me to his mom and his family, and I remember going into his home, and I had never been in a home that felt like that, and it was the presence of Jesus and a family that mom and dad was still married, and they really liked and loved each other, and the siblings were all sitting around, and then this guy took me on an airplane ride. He was a pilot. I think he was in the reserves for the Air Force. I'm not positive. I don't remember that, but his dad was a pilot, and so he had his pilot's license. And yeah, I this is what shame does to us. It makes us feel like we're not good enough. And they did not communicate that to me in any way, but I felt that about myself. And so I ended that relationship and went back to try to take somebody else captive, and an ex-boyfriend of mine, and try to get him to quit smoking pot. I mean, it was, I can see this so clearly now, but when you're in it, you just think that's just how it is, right? So the word says that there's no condemnation in Christ. And but I had shame, and that shame would not be fully healed within me until 2020. And that was with some deep spiritual healing that the Lord had to allow me to get to a place where I no longer had my idols. Really, it was really him taking down my idols, taking down my comforts, taking away the things that I thought made me have value and worth, and my self-sufficiency. And it broke in that I was able to break some vows that I will never depend on another person for my safety and security, because my husband had become a safe person, but this vow was now getting in the way. And so I am going to be talking, if you've never heard the concept of vows, that is actually one of the weapons that the enemy can use against us. So I'll be sharing more about that. But yeah, so in 2020, that is where I really stepped into knowing God, really knowing God, and really knowing my value and my worth, and really just seeing all the miracles and all of the ways that he was so creative, and how just the restoration that then took place. It was kind of like a Job story. It wasn't as physically harmful, but emotionally it was pretty darn bad. But I learned so much about God's character and goodness in that. And when something like that happens, and I'm cautious to say, did God cause that? Did he allow it? God does not, never will give, he won't give permission for somebody to sin and harm us, because that's not the character of God. He always protects. But the story of Job, if you have read that, it's this conversation between Satan and God. And Satan's like, well, of course he worships you. Of course he loves you. He's got everything, and it's easy. And so God says to him, well, he's going to love me anyway. You can go ahead and do whatever you want to him. Just don't kill him. And some of us can be like, well, why did God allow that? Because God knew that there was so much fruit coming out of that. In the same way, for me, when I think back to that horrible time, I would have never signed up for that. I would have never, ever, ever been a participant of that. But I didn't understand the fruit that was going to come out of that. But what I didn't do was turn my back on God. What I did do was lean in, even when it didn't make sense, even when it was hard, even when it was scary, even when I just was so crippled in shame, and just wondering, questioning my purpose. And I mean, there was some dark days that I didn't even know that I wanted to be here. That's how bad it got around 2018, which led me to this season into 2020, where I guess it was 2019 into 2020. Yeah. And then the Lord has just healed me. I have like just so much faith and so much confidence in his love for me. It is a freedom that I have never known. And so but I had to walk through all of that for him to refine, and all of this stuff that needed to get off of me. Have you ever walked in the woods and you get these chiggers? They're just like clinging to you, kind of like that. And now I'm like, no, there is nothing that the enemy can hold over my head, because I am free. I'm not walking in insecurities. I'm not walking in shame. I'm not walking in these burdens of not knowing who I am or whose I am, or doubting God's goodness, because after walking through what I have walked through in my life, there is no doubt whatsoever that God will do what he says that he will do. So I did finally learn that love is not conditional. Love can hurt sometimes because there's no intimacy without vulnerability, and we're dealing with humans. And so we do get hurt sometimes. But when I, was able to heal from all of this, and I was really able to experience God's love in that deep, deep way that it is intended. And the thing about shame is it's a direct attack on our identity, and that is formed when our needs are not met when we're young. And that is that it makes it impossible, or we're unable to get a healthy, developed sense of self when we have these wounded attachments, because we're not able to fully walk in the way that Christ designed for humans to be, because the plan for humans when he created us and our brains and our hearts and our entire system was wired to work correctly. But with the fall, there was a backup plan, right? And so now our flesh seems to be working against the spirit because of the patterns in the world and because of this woundedness and all of that. But we can heal. And again, the attachment wounding that we have, it is not, and I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. But the beautiful thing about attachment wounds, this isn't a personality where you're wounded and you're going to stay wounded. That's not the word of God. Our attachment wounds can be healed, and we can move from a wounded attached person into a securely attached person through restoration. It's so beautiful. So my wounds of unmet needs, neglect, and abuse led me to a wounded attachment style called anxious preoccupied, also known as disorganized attachment style. So that is, for those of us who have this style, it's like this push-pull pattern of intense connection followed by a sudden withdrawal or anger. So when I said I would pursue people, and then it was like I just needed to have that intensity and feeling loved and seen. And then when they would actually value me and see me, then I would kind of push them away. And that stems from an unpredictable childhood, the upbringing that involved high reactivity, fear of abandonment, and frequent relationship conflict, which is what I observed. It's what I experienced. So then I went on and I married an avoidant attachment, which was really a reenacting of my own trauma of having an absent father and an emotionally unavailable mother. So I chose a partner because of my wounding, and this happens unconsciously, but that's what was comfortable for my system. The word tells us in the Israelites, when they were in the wandering in the wilderness, some of them started grumbling and complaining. They're like, just take me back to Egypt. Just take me back to Egypt. At least we had food there, right? That is kind of like what this was. Like we feel like because something is comfortable, that is what's normal and that is what is good. But God is calling us to trust him, and it will get uncomfortable as we're stepping into change, as we're stepping into growth, as we're coming out of the captivity, these patterns that just replay over and over and over again in our life. He's trying to tell us, hey, if you trust me, I'll lead you into the promised land. But we want to complain and get caught in all these other defense mechanisms that we're going to be talking about on the strategies of the enemy that will keep us stuck in these patterns. So I did end up pursuing my husband, and I felt like I finally won love with him when I got him to love me. And only he was not capable of really loving me until he got healthy. And again, if you heard my testimony, part 1, I'm going to share more about our marriage and struggles in part 2. And I do have the recording from him sharing at our Overcomers meeting when he celebrated 8 years of sobriety. So I will be posting that on the podcast. But here's the thing about shame. So with shame, we will be stuck in fear of being exposed. We'll be fearing because we feel like a fraud. We don't have a sense of self or identity when we're turning on ourselves. So shame is the kind of the opposite of loving God, loving ourselves like our neighbor, because shame is essentially turning on ourselves. It's feeling like we are unlovable. We are not valuable. So until we heal this shame from our life, we are not going to be able to love others in the abundant way and live the abundant life and freedom in Christ with that present. They cannot coexist. So with shame, we get stuck in these patterns. We'll be overcompensating. We'll be in self-loathing and or self-sabotage. will be living in insecurities, and they might not be present all the time, but they'll show up when we're kind of being called into our purpose, called into something that the Lord wants us to do, or when we have an opportunity that stretches us. The insecurities are going to make us shrink back and go, oh no, I don't know if I could do that. Shame requires us to prove to ourselves and others that we're okay, and through the external evidence. So if I'm internally not feeling okay, I'm going to try to make the okay through external evidence. And that might be obsessive compulsive behaviors, compulsive caretaking. For me, I got as a kiddo, I didn't realize this until well into recovery, but I was really kind of OCD about, I'm not the diagnostic, but I'm using that as an adjective. I was obsessive compulsive with cleaning my room because externally I couldn't control anything there, what was happening outside of my bedroom or even what was happening inside of me, but I could get my room clean. And so obsessive compulsive disorder most likely is people's wounds that continued. They didn't kind of fall off. They continued into adulthood and got worse and worse and worse until someone gets into recovery. Perfectionism, workaholism, overachieving, or the opposite, living stuck in fear of life, fear of success, fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, eating disorders, excessive dieting, the list goes on. So shame is the culprit for all of this. And shame entered the world as soon as Adam and Eve sinned from being deceived by the serpent. And then they had, of course, to leave the garden. And Jesus came back to make it possible for us to not be living in shame anymore. Shame keeps us from trying to escape from the pain from being us, fear of being exposed, and living disconnection from God and self and others in the way that God calls us to. And or we're continuing to need to cover up the pain with coping using drugs and alcohol, porn, gambling, eating, getting lost in romance novels. Yeah, no Christian woman should be reading 50 Shades of Grey or any of those other trashy romance novels. That is one of the plans of the enemy to get us discontent with our own marriages, right? And I'm going to go into all kinds. I have no end to the strategies that the enemy has been using in this world, guys. Like it is, I see it clear as day. And my goal and hope and prayer and believe why God called me to do this podcast with you is so that you can see it also. But people can get lost in TV. People are actually bonding with TV characters. God calls us to bond with Him, bond with other believers. People are bonding with their favorite characters on television. If anyone's listening to this and relating, I get really sad when a TV show's over. That's probably wounded attachment, and you connected with something about that character. That is a strategy of evil to keep us from connecting with other humans, being afraid of other humans. People on TV are safe. They will not hurt us. Same thing with pornography and or paid experiences. There's no need for vulnerability. There's no risk of rejection. There is no needing to put on the mask of perfection at the expense of or at the risk of being rejected or abandoned. There is no risk there when you're paying for a service like that or you're just on a screen. And so that is why it's addictive. And so there's so many different counterfeit ways that people are getting their needs met in illegitimate ways. And the enemy is laughing. And God's going, I am not a God that is trying to control you. I am a God that is trying to lead you to freedom. You keep thinking that I'm this controlling father, that I'm this egomaniac. I created you. I know what you need. I know what your minds need. I know what your bodies need. I created you. You're choosing not to listen to me. You're choosing to be in obedience. You're choosing to listen to the patterns of the world and your fear and your anxiety and keep going back to Egypt instead of trusting me to take you to the promised land. Whew, y'all, God is a good God. He is telling us basic instructions before leaving earth for our freedom, not for control or any other motive. Like the humans around us have other motives, God does not. All right, I'm going to end shortly. I know this is getting long. Living with a shame-based identity and attachment wounds keeps us from being able to love God, self, and others in the way God calls us to. So once again, and Pastor Christian talked about this verse again today, but when Jesus told us in Luke 9:23 that if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself and take up the cross daily and follow him. The self that he is asking us to deny is our shame-filled, self-seeking, wounded selves that is clamoring for love in all the wrong places, seeking pleasure to cover up the pain with counterfeit comfort and sinful desires of an unhealed heart. We deny that self. And when we heal and realize how good God is and how loved we are in God's perfect love that casts out all fear, we can be free from the schemes of the enemy. Jesus said we have to lose our life, which is a life that we created for our survival before we were able to receive the pure love of God. But we have to participate with the ongoing sanctification process and dying to the self that wants to keep self-protecting us, but getting in the way of the protection that God is calling us to by telling us how we need to live life. But we get scared and we don't trust, and we feel like God is, again, the people who hurt us, and he is not. But I'm going to end on this. What an amazing God we serve, because he doesn't waste a thing. God isn't calling us into healing our wounded selves so we can become someone different. That seems really scary, right? Like, I don't know if I want to die to myself. Maybe you really like some beautiful parts about yourself. Good. He does too. He is asking us to step fully into who he has called us to be. He is the potter and we are his clay. He loves our quirks, our creative expressions, our strengths, and he wants us to depend on him and other safe people in areas where we're weak. It's okay that we need help. God made us to need him. If we were able to do everything on our own, we would be self-sufficient. And that is what I operated out of because of my woundedness. But each time I have learned that I don't have to operate by myself, and nor do I do a great job of that. I need to have wise counsel. I need to have a covering. I need to have a community. And I need him to lead me to that. And I need to stop going back to Egypt and doing the same thing over and over and over again. So this requires us to let go of our false selves, our self-protective strategies, and let go of any vow that we made in times of pain and trauma, and to learn that he is not the father that left us. He's not the emotionally absent or hurtful caregiver. He is who he says he is. He will do what he says that he will do. He delights in us even when our parents did not or could not. He still has a plan and a purpose for us. He will use what the enemy meant for evil for good. And that's from Genesis 50:20. He is a good God, and you are valuable to him. I hope and pray that this blessed you and challenged you. You might need to listen to it again and pause and take notes. I will have a couple of reflection questions in the show notes for you if you want to take this a little bit deeper as like a devotion. But I pray that you're blessed. I hope that you are growing and that God is revealing what he wants you to see, hear, and know about how loved and valuable you are. God bless.